Hello, everyone. I'm Zach Ader, Director of Guest Experience and Engagement. Welcome to the Nature of Conservation discussion hosted by the Chicago Academy of Sciences Peggy Note Nature Museum. Today, we have an hour worth of content for you, followed by questions from the audience. Any questions you have, please communicate them through the chat option. Please make sure the settings in your chat are set to all participants. We will be reviewing your questions through the event, and we will be answering them after the panelist discussion. Now, I would like to hand it off to our President and CEO, Deb Lahey.
Thank you, Zach, and welcome everyone, the panelists and our participants. It's a great thing that we're trying to do tonight, and I hope you and your families are well and safe. And please know that we really miss you coming into the museum every single day, and we're grateful that we are able to be together remotely and find some time to celebrate Earth Day. And as I'm sure you know, it is the 50th anniversary. But I must say that this is not how we envisioned we'd be celebrating this 50th anniversary. You know, although we cannot be outside celebrating the arrival of spring, and with the usual familiarity of reconnecting with the nature that is right around us after a long winter. But because of the lack of physical connection to nature, perhaps this is the most important Earth Day yet. In real time, we have been seeing the necessity of science, and we have seen just how connected our lives are to the natural world. This pandemic will be gone. We'll be on the other side of it at some point in time. We don't know what that's going to look like. But the one thing that we know, and that I know, is that the need for science has never, ever been greater. And for me, that means that this Earth Day is a renewal of my commitment to encourage and inspire stewardship of our natural world. We still have dual ecological and climate crises that we must address, and we will do that with science. This evening, we are going to hear about how, given all this change, we can save the natural world that we love. And for the Nature Museum, this only clarifies our mission and vision to inspire young minds with a passion for science and a sense of wonder. I would encourage you to join us remotely all week long as we celebrate Earth Day. We have ideas to share with you and how we can heal our relationships with the natural world. You can visit us at naturemuseum.org to view activities, sign up to receive our daily newsletter in your inbox, and if you are able, to make a gift to the museum in honor of Earth Day. Now, I want to thank you again for joining us, and hope that you are all well and safe. And I want to hand this off to my good friend, Jill Allred, who will host the rest of the evening.
Thank you so much, Deb, for your inspiring words and for all that your team is doing. I get the daily learn from the Nature Museum, and I have learned so much by tapping in and doing those programs. Good evening to all of you, and thank you for tapping in tonight. We're pleased to have an amazing panel who's here tonight to share some really thought-provoking ideas and insights, and from very different perspectives on this eve of Earth Day's 50th anniversary. You'll hear their observations and thoughts about change as it relates to our world, our environment, and also our lives. As Deb acknowledged, this is not how we expected to commemorate Earth Day's anniversary, sheltered at home, in hopes of saving lives during the COVID-19 crisis. But perhaps this forced time out for us is really going to provide a moment of reflection about what we value and what brings us comfort beyond the mac and cheese and baking bread that so many people I know have been doing as we shelter in place. For many, this has fostered a longing to be outdoors, to hear the spring migratory birds, and to see spring greening, to be in parks, to run along the lakefront here in Chicago, to be feeling connected with nature. And perhaps this is going to increase awareness in how nature does provide that comfort and restore us in the most troubling times. This can lead to profound change, which may be one of the most significant things that happens with this Earth Day's 50th anniversary. The panel we have that is going to be having discussions tonight about nature and conservation. I'm going to introduce them just briefly. They'll tell you more about themselves, but I'm going to have them give a little wave. Dr. Megan Bang. Megan, folks know that Megan is a professor of the learning and sciences and psychology at Northwestern University, and she's also senior vice president at the Spencer Foundation. Cindy Crosby, Cindy's going to give a little wave there. There you go. She's an educator, an author, contributor, or co-author to more than 20 books, including one that's coming up that you should put on your must-read list, Chasing Dragonflies, A Natural, Cultural, and Personal History. Alex Rose is science editor for Ocean Geographic magazine, and she's managing editor for Ocean Geographic Explorers, and a professional photographer and violinist and a dive master and lover of all things aquatic. And in fact, Alex has started in 2017 an organization promoting conservation called Blue Ring that looks at ways to make ocean conservancy accessible. And we'd like to hear more about that, Alex. And then Dr. Allison Velades. She's curator of herpetology at the Academy of Sciences and Peggy Notebart Nature Museum. Allison knows everything about smooth green snakes and wood frogs. It's her favorite time of year and has worked diligently to restore and save these populations of these animals here in our region, which really is the focus of the Nature Museum's collection. So we'll begin with some questions related to the change and uncertainty is kind of the top of everyone's mind right now on so many things, including when we look at the changes of Earth. Earth is changing constantly. It's part of nature to be changing and dynamic, but how do the changes that we are currently witnessing, for example, the threats of the sixth greatest extinction of wildlife and plant life in the world, water drought in pockets around the world, including here in the United States, air pollution, extreme weather events, and zoonotic diseases that, such as COVID-19, that demonstrate how closely we are tied to the natural world and wildlife, and if one has a problem, it's going to affect all of those things. So from your perspective, I'm going to start with Megan, talking about how does that all fit into the framework of the reality of what we're experiencing on these changes in the world. Megan.
I just want to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from what most people call Chicagoland, but is the original territories of the Three Fire people, the Potawatomi, the Odawa, and the Ojibwe peoples, and that these are our homelands and have been since time immemorial. And I start there because the question of change is interesting at what temporal scales we think of and what kinds of influences have made change. And so I am an educator. I study learning across the life course, and I, in particular, study something around the way that culture and cultural ways of knowing impacts how we conceptualize the natural world and humans' place in it. And over the course of human communities development, there has been really significant changes in how we imagine ourselves in relationship to the natural world. For me, I've been thinking with and trying to shift both understanding how those changes have impacted Indigenous communities specifically, but also understanding how larger societal structures are continually impacting that. So I guess I'll say just a couple things about how I think about this. Human communities have always had relationships with the natural world, but as our economic systems have shifted, the ways that we conceptualize natural resources and the consumption and extraction of natural resources for human use has shifted. And so I think a lot about how is it that we teach children about that. For example, we've done studies where we've looked at the materials used in education all over the place. And what we tend to do is create what we've called a separation between humans and nature. And so I appreciated the framing of today. But when we study human reasoning, we have an appreciation for nature, but we often don't reason all the way through about how our actions impact the natural world. There are many ways that our social systems have invisibilized that. And so people don't trace the long-term kinds of impacts of the ways that we live. And as a science educator, I am always working to change that and think about how ethics and science actually are interwoven. So I think that partly what we need to understand is how of our values about what it means to live, how we've constructed human communities have shifted to impact the natural world. And I guess what I'll say is that if you look over the long human histories, 80% of the world's biodiversity is in indigenous controlled lands. And so as we think about issues of ecological collapse and protecting biodiversity, how is it that we also understand how power, race, gendered, classed power, mediates our relationship in the ways that we engage in protecting the natural world, engaging with the natural world, and even conceptualize what we might do as we move forward as human communities. And I think, for me, the deep social inequalities that are on full display during this moment of COVID and the simultaneity of kind of the reprieve that the earth is getting from complicated and often damaging human activity is kind of stark juxtapositions that is a kind of wake-up call that I really hope that we don't actually yearn for a return to normalcy. For many of us, the normal has been part of the problem and is about deep injustices. And so for me, as I think about change, I hope we reach for a different world, a new world where conservation and sustainability, but also social justice is interwoven into what the world could be.
Thank you very much. And Cindy, building on that as a person who does interpretation a lot and simplifies these complex relationships that Megan talked about, can you address that what that change means from your perspective?
Absolutely. And I was just reading one of my favorite writers, Robin Wall Kimmerer, and one of her older books called Gathering Moss. She said she loved a tip jar at her local coffee shop that had a sign that said, "If you fear change, leave it here." And I love that because I think we all fear change. And as I've gotten older, I'm 59 now, I don't know that I've gotten more comfortable with change. Change is discomfort, and never have we felt that, right, so much as we have probably in the last 6 weeks. But at the same time, as I've older and experienced changes, I realize the importance of change, the importance of being flexible and adapting, being open to new ideas. I really loved what Megan said about returning to normal and how we don't want to return to normal. We've changed our idea of what is normal. We've changed our ideas of what is personally and nationally and globally achievable just in the past 6 weeks. How fast has all of that happened? And we've changed the way we live. We've changed the way we move in the world. We've even changed the way we breathe. the air that we breathe in the world. So every week as I blog about the prairie, I realize that the thing that is keeping me anchored is the natural world. It is the world I'm moving in. When everything else is chaos, it is those walks in the natural world that are saving my sanity. And in my small subdivision in the Chicago region, I see something happening I haven't seen before. Everyone is out walking. Everyone is working in their yards. Children are riding their bikes and playing basketball where I've seen empty driveways before. The forest preserves, when I go there, are packed with people. This abrupt change in the world, to me, is an opportunity. Just as changes in technology, changes in ecosystems, changes in climate, all present opportunities. It's an opportunity to help people develop a relationship with the natural world. Maybe not in the way I grew up with that relationship, as a kid playing outdoors all day. But there are new ways we can reach people and help them build that relationship. One of my other, I have many favorite writers, but I love Sigurd Olson, a Northwoods Boundary Waters writer. He said, while we are born with curiosity and wonder, and our early years are full of the adventure they bring, I know such inherent joys are often lost. I also know that because they're deep within us, their latent glow can be fanned into flame again by awareness and an open mind. And so as we navigate the challenges of new technology, the way our ecosystems are changing, the way our climate is changing, I believe that awareness and that open mind, if we can bring that to those problems, and if we can help through education and through sharing the natural world with people in new and different ways, if we can help them cultivate that awareness and open mind, change can be good. So as we navigate the changes this pandemic brings, we have this opportunity, and it's really up to us to find ways to lead out in it.
Thank you, Cindy, very much. And Alec, you go from the perspective of loving all things ocean, and certainly oceans have many mysteries for us, and a lot of emphasis on, when the oceans are such a significant part of our well-being. How do you see the change and with ocean health coming together at this time?
Well, obviously our topic is changing everything tonight, and change, I think it helps for people to understand it better if we make peace with the fact that it's inevitable, but that understanding the driving forces behind those changes is what allows us to both predict and react in ways that are grounded in logic instead of fear. As science editor for an ocean conservation magazine, what I do involves talking about scientific topics, particularly those related to ocean conservation, and then distilling them in a way that's understandable for everyone who's interested in learning more. Science is fascinating, and I think that's lost on too many people. And I try to use my enthusiasm for learning and for understanding to also get the general public excited about the natural world, particularly, maybe selfishly, for our big blue ocean. My mentor, Dr. Sylvia Earle, says a couple things that I always try to bring up when I start conversations. One of them is really simple. Her quote is, "No ocean, no life, no blue, no green." They're a really simple concept. And this, of course, is in reference to the incredible importance of our oceans and the myriad roles that they play, that all aquatic ecosystems play in sustaining life on Earth. Growing up in the Midwest, as I have, which is nowhere near the ocean, it can be easy to underestimate the impact the world ocean has on the daily life of a kid living in the western suburbs of Chicago. Which brings me to the second thing that Sylvia always likes to say. And the quote is, "No matter where on earth you live, every drop of water you drink and every breath you take connects us to the sea." And that statement had such a strong impact on me that it's kind of set me on the path that I've followed since I first met Sylvia at Shed Aquarium when I was 9 years old. Now I speak about that as often as possible. Whenever I start public presentations, I ask people to take 2 deep breaths with me. and then explained that one of those breaths was made possible by the ocean. More specifically, the photosynthetic life that lives in our ocean water. And even more specifically, a photosynthetic cyanobacterium with a super catchy name of Prochlorococcus that provides us with 1 out of every 5 breaths that we take. It's the most abundant marine organism on the planet, and most people have never even heard of it. So this just kind of speaks to the importance of science education in a way that really engages with people on this fundamental level of it just being super interesting. Just need to get people engaged in loving science again. I think that's what we're really missing a lot of lately, especially once we start to realize how interconnected all of us are and everything that we do and all things that we make are globally. And when I say things like that, I hope that it wakes people up to that interconnectedness of all living things and sort of inspires them to protect and love and protect our precious natural resources that we really can't get back once they're gone. And this sort of filters back to our current situation with COVID-19. Just in the last couple months, this pandemic has sort of proved to me over and over again how important science communication really is for all of us. And I've been vastly uncomfortable with the high level of science illiteracy that I've seen going on around this COVID-19 outbreak. And it's made me worry how we'll ever remedy this. And the answer to that is, of course, really complex and multifaceted and involves all of us in our different realms of expertise. But I think it all hinges on getting everyday people to engage in science in a meaningful and impactful way. This whole situation reminds me of another quote. I quote people a lot, so I apologize, by Tim Worth. And the quote is, "The economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment." And to me, what this really drives home is that we need to stop defining progress in terms of exponential GDP growth and start using quality of life as a metric for prosperity. We need to focus on ecosystems instead of stocks and general well-being instead of individual wealth. Humans thriving doesn't necessarily have to mean wildlife suffering. And by the same coin, nature flourishing doesn't automatically equate to humanity languishing. These are not mutually exclusive categories. There can, in fact, be very much needed balance. And we have the opportunity to use this same global connectedness that helped spread COVID-19 to instead reimagine our world in the image of sustainability and cooperation. This temporary pause that we've all been sort of forced to take might be the best opportunity human society has yet been given to step back and assess our place on this planet. And I think this is our chance for harmony, to make that change towards a harmonious way of living. And I just really hope we don't squander it, which is why I think having conversations like this that we're having tonight ensures that we won't. So I guess that's my piece for now.
Very good, thank you. And Allison, as your co-panelists have talked about that relationship with nature and the change, and someone mentioned climate, and then the sixth extinction. You are so intimately involved in species that have been on the brink, and working very hard to make sure that they stay in our environment here in Chicagoland. From that perspective, kind of the global perspective, how do you see the changes that we're going through now as being an opportunity or a challenge, or both?
Well, I think that one of the challenges is something that Megan mentioned right off the bat, that there is this perception of humans being separate from the ecosystem, separate from nature. Nature is thought of as often a bubble. We're protecting nature, but we live here in the city. We're in an age that people refer to now as the Anthropocene, where everything that is going on in our environment has impacts emanating from human actions, and all those changes in the ecosystem in turn are going to reverberate in some way, ripple, and have consequences for us. One of the well-known population ecologists, Ehrlich, had likened species to bolts on an airplane. And we may not know the role that every single bolt plays in the ecosystem of the airplane. And we might be able to lose a few over time, and that plane might still fly, but how many can we continue to lose before the entire thing falls from the sky and collapses? That is often the impetus behind a lot of conservation thinking in terms of species conservation. People ask, why would you care about this small snake? Why would you care about a tiny mouse or a tiny frog or, a spider? It's not necessarily up to us to assign value to individual species, to their rights to exist. That concept kind of threads through some of the other points that Cindy and Alex and Megan all touched on in terms of valuation of ecosystems, value of nature, how we're making economic decisions. These are things that have to be blended together quite a bit more. In conservation biology field, there really is a move toward examining more human dimensions, and instead of just putting our species specialist glasses on and just going ahead with tunnel vision, focusing on the particular frog or snake that I work on, there is a move toward integrating collaboration with social scientists. How can we engage more people? How can we bring more voices to the table? And how can we show people that they, in fact, are part of this larger picture? Whether you're in a city, whether you're in a rural environment, whether you live next door to a national park, we all interact with species, and wildlife is going to be found in all of those habitats, no matter how paved they become. And as such, we have to think about how the decisions we make, whether it's reducing our footprint, whether it's how we restore a habitat, how that can be best implemented with the least negative impact, not just for particular species, but for welfare of everyone.
Very good. And your response really tees up another question that relates to how can conservation, or the conservation perspective that all four of you address, how can that in a major metropolitan area like Chicago serve the needs of both people and the planet? I mean, there is a conflict, and a couple of you mentioned that nothing that is happening right now with the environment, it doesn't have a human impact or has been impacted by human behavior and action. How does conservation play that role in in a city like Chicago, where we have human needs and we also have the needs of the planet? Cindy, do you want to take that on?
Well, you can't separate the two. Whether we talk about the city of Chicago or we talk about the rural neighborhood that I grew up in, because conservation is where people build relationships. Conservation is where we realize the connections that join us to whatever particular place that we live and breathe and move. Mentally, nature is always giving to us. It's giving us our food. It's giving us our breath. I think, as someone said earlier, it's giving us our frame of mind. The sunshine we had today in Chicago, wow. I felt good, a rainy day, so we can't separate ourselves from that, no matter where we live. And it is reciprocal in turn when we build a relationship with the land, when we invest time and invest money and go out on a work day, as my volunteers do, on the prairie at the Morton Arboretum. That's, we are giving back, but the land is giving to us as well. And it's reciprocal, and there is value on both sides. It's something that when that relationship is present, when that awareness and open mind is present, then I believe it's hard to put a valuation on it, if you want to say that. Sometimes I think we can just offer a spark to kindle someone's interest in the natural world, and that spark then kindles a lifelong interest in conservation. In the city, those entry points might be different than they are in the suburbs or in a rural area or out, in big areas. But I always think of what Rachel Carson said. She's one of my heroes. She said, "Those who contemplate the beauty of the earth find reserves of strength that will endure as long as life lasts." So it's true. Those reserves of strength, I think, are what all of us have been finding as we experience the natural world in the last 6 weeks while we're sheltering in place. And it's the same thing that anyone can tap into, but we have to make those opportunities available.
Very good, thank you. And Megan, building on that, you mentioned earlier about values that have shifted to impact the world. When we look at an urban area like this, how do what is your feeling about how conservation efforts can meet both the needs of a large metropolitan area and the planet?
Well, I want to kind of just amplify a little bit of what was just said. Increasingly, we have evidence that people's engagement out in the outdoors isn't just it's this relational piece that we're talking about, but it manifests in our physical, our emotional, and our cognitive health. Quite literally, our microbial makeups in our bodies change depending upon how much time we spend outdoors, touching plant life, touching soil, being in close relations. And so also, increasingly there are studies about the inequality of green space distribution in large urban places that are correlated with other kinds of inequalities. And so the more we think about urban planning that actually cultivates the well-being of human worlds, as well as the natural world, even in urban space, the further we get along as communities too. So I think that one of the things that we all have to work towards is actually really trying to push beyond this idea that somehow dense human populations are necessarily in opposition to healthful natural worlds, and trying to evolve the way we imagine that. I'll also say that, so I'm a cognitive scientist, and general population's knowledge and expertise about the natural world has been devolving for the past 50 or 60 years. And so if we think about the devolution and actually decline, I might call it our cognitive decline around the natural world, you reason differently. There's something called psychological distance and closeness that makes you reason differently, as well as if you have different knowledge. If you have less knowledge, you reason differently about things that you don't know much about. And so over the last 50 years, there are studies that will show that undergraduate students know exponentially fewer plant names, fewer species of trees than we did 50 years ago. So I also think that there's this move that we could be thinking about is how do we create living classrooms that are in urban spaces or rural spaces? And so a lot of the work that I do is thinking about this movement to field-based science, the kind of science that conservationists do. And in US science education, I think we have a real opportunity here. There's been some big movements because of the next generation science standards to move from, when we first started teaching science, we thought about 5% of the population needed to be able to be scientists, and the rest of us would have a kind of scientific literacy that we now know is insufficient in that first place. And we actually, all of us need to know how to do science a bit more. We also created some models of science education based on lab sciences. So if you ask most young people who is a scientist or what they do, they'll fathom some view of somebody in a lab with a lab coat and some test tubes. The view of science as deeply engaged in relationships with the natural world isn't the messaging that we've been giving. And so in my work, I think a lot about what does it mean to actually get kids out of buildings and back onto land to learn. We've turned land into resource, or we've taught kids that being outside is play. And play is a wonderful place to learn, but we give kids playgrounds that are usually covered by squishy material and not much plant life. And so I've been thinking a lot about all these opportunities kind of transform the learning spaces and thinking about our relationships and our very infrastructures that would have kind of rippled impacts on how humans think, how we act, what we find joyful in the everyday, and just how we reason about things at multiple scales. Turns out when you do that with even the youngest of children, they start reasoning more like ecologists and expert scientists about the multiple grain sizes and effects in ecosystems. Pretty young. It's not a hard shift to get in motion, but it's a question of where we're engaging them and how we're engaging them.
Very good. Allison, building on Megan's very thought-provoking ideas and how things have changed, the Nature Museum every day is providing those kinds of insights online through nature education, giving parents some quality material to keep their kids occupied as they're trying to balance having the kids at home and working from home. Do you see effective ways that you can continue to try to cultivate that next generation of people and young people who care about the environment through the kind of things that the Nature Museum is offering, or is what's the additional void that needs to be filled?
I absolutely think that there's a great jumping off point for getting children involved in data collection. Going out, using different community science apps, the technology that's available now that wasn't available 5-10 years ago is really incredible, because children can not only go out and try to figure out what plants are in their area, but they can contribute to scientific studies in doing so. So using software like iNaturalist provides, using data that are already available, that are collected from other community science programs, and bringing that into the classroom is actually helping teachers build curriculum based on the natural world. I know in our education department, we try to use real data from the natural world and from scientific studies as much as possible. Now, certainly when you're stuck at home, you can't go outside, it becomes quite a bit more challenging, but I do think that this is where we can rely quite a bit more heavily on technology and the advances that we have to bring scientists into the classroom, bring scientists into people's home. I know through Twitter, there was Skype with a scientist, sign up sheet, other kind of online modules that are becoming available where science is becoming more accessible. So not only are students able to kind of go out, figure out whether they want to go into kind of a lab career, but they can actually talk to scientists doing these types of unique work, whether it's ocean conservation, whether it's, studying Alpine Flora, whether it's studying microbes. I think that whole world is much more accessible, and having platforms and programs that foster that is just continuing to increase.
Building on your mention, Allison, of ocean conservation, Alex, you created an organization to try to increase accessibility. What is your take, and how do you view kind of bringing people in alignment with understanding the ocean, understanding their role, and cultivating that next generation of conservationists?
Yeah, so for me, conservation is this concept that I wish people viewed a little bit differently. They tend to look at it as if conservation is a thing that you do instead of a way that you live. And I think there's a real disconnect there. It's like they think that, you go to a place and you participate in a beach cleanup and you've done a conservation event. Good job. And yes, that is great. That's really good to be able to say that you've done this thing and kind of check it off a list. But I feel like so much of our social media culture pushes people towards bucket lists. And it's not meant to be like that. Like conservation is a long-term investment. And it's a big topic. And this is how I sort of started Blue Ring, was because I talk about ocean conservation with people a lot. And overwhelmingly, they get really depressed when they realize what's actually going on out there. Like the issues are big, like plastic pollution in the ocean is a huge problem. Ocean warming because of our changing climate, that's a huge problem. Ocean acidification, huge problem. Coral bleaching, huge problem. Like it's easy to look at this stuff and be completely polarized by it because the issues are so large, you don't know what to do or how you could possibly help. And it's paralyzing. And I think that's sort of where a lot of the apathy comes from with people. It's not that they don't care. They just have no idea how to help. So with Blue Ring, it's kind of a simple concept. It was meant to be just an annual membership that's affordable and that your money's going somewhere good. So what it is, it's a $25 annual membership, and people can be adopted by the sea or they can marry the ocean, depending. And you get a ring or a pendant that you can wear. And it's sort of like a community builder. You can look at somebody across the way from you and go, oh, they have one too. Cool, they care too. And it's accessible because it's inexpensive and it's fun and it's positive and it's a way to communicate conservation in a way that is not unreachable for anybody. I donate 75% of what I make annually to a different ocean conservation nonprofit. So for me, it's a way to give back to an industry that has given me everything. And I realized that being in the ocean is not accessible for everybody, especially growing up in the Midwest. I didn't really get in the ocean, until I was probably in my teen years. And by that time, luckily, I spent a lot of time at Chicago Shedd Aquarium. Those were formative experiences for me. But if people aren't doing that, you don't develop that connection with the sea. And not everyone can go see a kelp forest live snorkeling in California because it's expensive to get to California and to get out on a boat and to go see that for yourself. So our institutions like nature museums and like aquariums are so critical to still have because people can come so close to experiencing those things for real that it doesn't seem unreachable. And that's supplemented with things like virtual reality is really incredible. Like seeing what can be done with virtual dives, like to take a whole group of kids on a virtual dive with a real scientist and go through and say, look to your left, you'll see a whale shark, and tell them about whale sharks. Like for a lot of people, that's the closest you're going to get for a long time. But the fact that that's even an option is fantastic. So there's like less and less of an excuse for us to not engage in conservation as a lifestyle with all of the opportunities that are now becoming available to us. So yeah, there's a lot to be done.
And building on that, you talk about the influence on people and what that means to building a conservation ethic. And that's another word. Like conservation can be quite controversial one interprets it as an action, another as a way of life, another as something that is always taken out of context. And it challenges us when we don't have that language to have that commonality. But let's talk about conservation ethic. And Megan, I'm going to have you kick this off because you think a lot about that in you're looking at the studies of what people, how they perceive nature. And to you, what is conservation ethic?
Well, I don't have a singular definition about this. So I'm going to take an opportunity to say that one of the things that I study a lot about is how people place value. And I spent a lot of time studying Indigenous people's ways of thinking about that ethic and non-Indigenous people's ways of thinking about that ethic, and the kinds of daily practices that we engage in as kind of a predictor of what our value systems are. And to me, at the core that you can see across cultural communities is how we think about extracting resources, what we're entitled to extract, and what we're willing to ensure that we don't engage in harmful behaviors. And so I spend a lot of time with kids asking them to contemplate what we call should we questions and should we actions. And And for me, really the ethic that you're talking about is what is a balance between what humans need to live and also how can we do that in ways that continually cultivates biodiversity writ large. One of the things that I think is really interesting about the history of human communities is we used to help cultivate biodiversity. It's actually not the case that all human communities have always had damaging impacts on the places that they've lived in terms of the natural world. And so I think there's a real opportunity for us to think about that conservation ethic and to think about what worlds we're choosing, especially as we go into post-COVID worlds. Do we really need the amount of material that we have? Can we be ingenious in developing new solutions? And can we think about moderating our use in all different kinds of ways? One of the things that I find really important about this moment of COVID is that it's the first time in probably 4 or 5 generations that families have been together every day where work hasn't been the center of life. And it means that there's a kind of relational bonding that could be happening, and that family and the kinds of, I heard everyone talk about everybody's everyday behaviors are different. There's walks, there's being outdoors, there's a kind of slowing of life that isn't driven by the same kinds of relationship to work and economy that has always been there. So for me, I will say that I think there are ways to have successful economies. There has been in the history of the world, but there is also a kind of moderation that we need to start considering. And there are other places in the world. So it's, this is a question of a US system and some other nations, but there are other places in the world that are starting to really see ways of thinking about a balanced form of life where we're valuing the natural world differently and that we're thinking about our well-being, our human well-being. And it's just very interesting to me that as we think about human well-being and doing the things we need so that there is well-being justly and evenly distributed, you can get to a natural world well-being faster as well. So for me, that conservation ethic increasingly is about this valuing of both human life and more than human life, and not sort of positioning humans, what I and lots of scholars are calling kind of formations of human supremacy, where humans are sort of apex predators entitled to extract whatever we want from the earth. But what does it mean to live more humbly on the earth together towards better collective futures?
You mentioned early in your comments about asking kids questions of should we? And it's a fascinating question, 2-word, wonderful question to really mine people's thought processes. Has there been anything that surprised you as you ask the should we question?
Well, a couple of things. Kids need practice at that, just like adults do. Asking kids to think about should we questions, we haven't done. And yet a core part of child development is thinking about developing senses of rightness and wrongness and what it means to be a good person. That's kind of core to what identity development is. And yet we've sort of sequestered some of those things. And so some of our work, for example, with kindergartners is we ask them things like they end up generating questions by walking and us helping to scaffold attention to all the kind of amazing natural phenomena that happens even in the alleys of Chicago. And they generate should we questions and thinking about everyday kinds of decisions. So for example, I've had a kindergarten classroom ask the question, should we rake our leaves? Another kindergarten classroom, should we remove the dead wood from the pathways? And that they've seen actually the everyday ways that people move things. And part of what's interesting about the should we question is how do we answer should we questions well? And it's been a really powerful way for kids to also desire data. So the we here, not should I didn't say should I said should we. And I think we often position children to answer from an I, not from a we. And that we call that an independent self. There's a kind of psychological model of self. And sometimes I think the US is good at cultivating what people call an independent model of psychological self, the cultivation of the I instead of the we. And it's part of when we look at civics education and civic engagement broadly, a lot of scholars are talking about that part of the reason we see disruptions in our civic engagement, sorry, I have a phone call coming in, is because we haven't done enough of that we positioning, that collective thinking, that collective deliberation, and that collective decision making. So the should we questions what kids answer often becomes having to grapple with complex data sets, complex sets of values, and having to think about affordances and constraints to making any decision, and recognizing how hard good decisions are to make. What I think is most surprising is how much young people feel agentic, are excited to learn, are ready to step into roles of leadership when you give them the opportunity to engage in that kind of ethical reasoning as much as the scientific reasoning.
Very good. And that really bridges to the kinds of classroom activity that Allison, you and your colleagues at the Nature Museum see every day. It's just a beehive of school children coming in classes and contemplating. Nature is fun, nature is exciting, but there's some real nature questions that come from your perspective as an educator, as a scientist. You mentioned earlier, data collection and analysis is really important. How does the conservation ethic come in and weave together with that when you're talking with young people that often coming to the Nature Museum may be their first and deepest connection to nature and understanding it?
Well, I think it ties in when we talk about conservation programs that tend to be more applied programs. So with our Blandings turtles that we have in our Mysteries of the Marsh exhibit, these are turtles that were head starting. So they're taken from eggs, hatched out, and we're rearing them up for about a year or so, and then we're working with partner agencies to release them back out. And children want to know why we're doing that. And inherent in that discussion, we have a lot of topics that we can start exploring, like how humans have impacted the number of predators that these turtles now face. So in Chicago and most urban areas, we have what we call subsidized mesopredators. So these are species like raccoons and skunks, opossums occasionally, that can live in close association with us. They can thrive using food sources that we're providing, and then they can have basically an excessive population growth beyond what a natural ecosystem would support that hasn't been altered in the ways that humans alter it. In those cases, they're applying more predation pressure on the turtles. So if we do nothing, if we say hands off, we're not going to help the turtles, we won't have turtles, because the number of nests that those raccoons that we're essentially feeding, the number of nests that actually survive is about 10% in nature. So that begs the question, how involved should we get? It's one example in a series that relate to the different programs we do. Similarly, when we're restoring habitat, there's a question of what benchmark we're using for our restoration endpoint. What are we trying to get an ecosystem back to? Many people will ask kind of restoration ecologists and conservation ecologists questions about, why can't you just leave it? Why can't you be hands off? Why don't you let nature take its course? When you take that perspective, although I understand where it's coming from, it's essentially ignoring a series of actions that humans have done that have degraded habitats more and more and precipitated the loss of more and more species. So conservation ethics does play a big role in kind of guiding those types of actions. How often should we intervene? Is this the best use of conservation resources? This is something that conservation biologists often struggle with the concept of triage. We have limited conservation funding, limited resources. Where do we put it, and how do our conservation ethics guide those types of decisions? What is the most effective thing we can do with the few precious resources that we have in terms of making a bigger impact in terms of protecting biodiversity? So at the museum in particular, because we have these hands-on projects that we're partnering with our neighboring landowners, these are projects that are in our backyard, it does offer visitors, whether they're children, whether they're adults, a little bit of insight into these processes that are going on around us, why we're doing this, why we're restoring these different habitats, and why we often need to become so involved in, particularly in an urbanized setting.
Very good, thank you. Cindy, you've written lots of books and contributed to lots of books, and conservation ethic is probably something that you think about weaving into those, and being a lover of words and messages. To you, what is conservation ethic?
That's a great question. My passion is, before people think of resource use, allocation, exploitation, often the words and the emotions they feel when they hear those words are shame, guilt, blame. There's a lot of negative associations with conservation. So my conservation ethic is to get behind that and to engage and help them build a relationship with some part of the natural world. So a good example is probably my prairie volunteers. Every Tuesday morning they come out, and a lot of them are coming out for exercise. Other people are coming out because they love the natural world. But you can always kind of tell after a few weeks, someone will say, so why are we doing this again? Why are we cutting this buckthorn? How come we're pulling all this garlic mustard? Great questions. They're awesome questions, and it really gives us a chance to talk about the why of conservation. Why does it matter? Why does the health of the natural world matter? Why do my actions matter? Why should this place be diverse instead of just being buckthorn? And there are questions I never get tired of revisiting, and questions I think we need to continue revisiting, because once you help them make a connection to what they're doing, once you help them see that it's relevant to them, that once you help them care and start building a relationship with a particular place or insect, or we just planted the Eastern Prairie Fringed Orchid, and we already have a group that's very excited about taking care of it and monitoring it and collecting data. Once you understand how all the pieces fit together, then all these things like, I should probably I should probably choose my fish for dinner more sustainably, or probably fracking is not going to be good, for this piece of land, or probably this copper mine, if you've done dragonfly data collection, all of a sudden the copper mine up in Minnesota has new meaning to you because of the water and because the connection. So I think my conservation ethic is really built around getting under people's skin and helping them see the wonder and awe of the natural world and how those things are connected, and then letting them make those connections for themselves, rather than I really want to help them make their own connections so they have ownership of them, rather than just telling them things that I believe is the right way to do, conservation. And I don't always agree with some of the conclusions they have, and they don't always agree with me. But wow, what a wonderful, stimulating world it is when people are aware and open-minded and able to have these conversations about the natural world and about ethics and what ethics are. One of the reasons I'm so grateful to be able to listen to everyone here tonight.
Wonderful. And Alex, I'm going to have you address that same question. But first, I want to take a quick pause and invite the audience tonight to send questions to the panelists. You've had a really in-depth look at some of the ideas and perspectives that they have been sharing, and they would love to hear and entertain your questions. So go to your chat button and type those in, and we will convey those. But as those questions are being formulated and added, Alex, would love to hear your perspective. Cindy set you up nicely talking about sustainable seafood and people getting more attentive to the environment and what their role is and can be. Ocean conservation has been a big topic of discussion and is only going to get bigger. Where does conservation ethics fall into what can be done and should be done?
So, I guess conservation ethics can have multiple different meanings. At its most basic level, I guess having a conservation ethic is referring to, maintaining the health of the natural world in terms of its forests, its fisheries, its habitats, its biological diversity. But even more so than that, it's an active commitment to protecting our wild spaces. And I think, at least in the United States, a prime example of something that we've done so well are our national parks. It's probably the best idea America has ever had in terms of land usage and setting aside space just for the natural world to exist in an unaltered form. So national parks, things like that are extremely important for us to support, and something similar in our ocean habitats. When you look at how much of land is protected to how much of the ocean is protected, the difference is massive. Obviously, the ocean is far more expansive, but it's also much harder to patrol. When you think about the open ocean, it's almost unreachable for a lot of people, especially in terms of it being protected. So investing in our marine protected areas and then the protection of our marine protected areas, not just designating something with a name, but actually taking steps to make sure that it remains protected is really critical. And it's not something that we've done a lot of in the United States yet, but we see more of it in island nations in particular because they're so tuned into how important their ocean resources are. One of my favorite examples is of Palau. Palau is this tiny island nation in the middle of the Pacific. Closest thing is Guam. And for essentially the entire existence of the country, dating back into thousands of years ago when they still have their written and verbal histories, they talk about what they call a bull. And that was avoiding fishing for anything that they needed while it was spawning. So it's this mutual respect for the environment. Conservation is not saying that you can't take anything to use from the environment. It's that you need to think about how you're taking it and what you're taking. And as Megan said, do you need it? And if you do, how much of it do you need? It's just being conscious of not taking to take because you can. It's just taking what you need and leaving the rest so that it can replenish itself. Palau has done an incredible job with that, and they've essentially made their entire exclusive economic zone a fishing-free area other than for sustainable and local fishermen. People cannot come in and fish in Palau's waters, at least not very readily and not very easily. Would probably be good to do that in a lot more places to really value our wild spaces and leave them alone because they need to exist without the influence of people in a lot of areas in order to replenish themselves naturally. An example of how that hasn't happened and sort of going back to that image of taking bolts out of a plane and then seeing how long it takes for the plane to fall apart, is what we've sort of collectively done to the cod fishery. It collapsed in the 90s. And since then, there's been a lot of efforts to rebuild that, and that's great. Obviously, fishing has been reduced. The population has rebounded somewhat. But the factors that we keep forgetting is that once you've taken too many pieces away from the puzzle, even when you put back what you have, chances are you've lost some of the pieces along the way. And this is the case with the genetic code of cod. We've spent so many decades taking the biggest fish, the biggest fish, the biggest fish, that now what's left, which is less than 5% of the original population, the historic population, is a smaller fish. It's not the same animal anymore. We have selectively removed all of the fish that gave cod its diversity. And diversity is the reason things are able to rebound in a changing environment. And when you've taken away that variability on a genetic level, it's almost impossible for a species to come back from that. Then you add on to the fact that their primary food sources, things like haddock and mackerel, which need really clean waterways to spawn in, those waterways aren't clean anymore. So their food fish are not there either. So you can stop fishing for them entirely, but they're not going to come back in the same way because their habitat has changed and the habitat of their prey species has changed as well. So it's just, I think in general, this conservation ethic is so much based on only taking what we need and not just taking what we want because we can. So I think a lot of indigenous peoples kind of have had it right all over the world for a long time. And our developed nations have sort of forgotten what development should mean. So, yeah.
You have all given amazing perspectives on conservation ethic and a great deal to think about in that interconnectedness. We're getting some questions in from our participants, our viewers, listeners, and a couple educators. And one of them, a third grade teacher, who's said, "Where do I start in my third grade classroom? Because there's just so much. It feels overwhelming." Who would like to offer some advice to the third grade teacher who would like to take in? Cindy, I see your hand waving. There you go.
I'm so excited you asked this question. So pick something that you're passionate about, because kids are smart. And if they see that you are excited and curious and you're really interested in something that you're teaching them about in the natural world, they'll catch that. And it's really hard to fake it. So find something that fits whatever curriculum you have to teach. Find something that you really, really are passionate about in the natural world. It could be wildflowers, it might be wildlife, and narrow it down and then take it and run with it. And they'll catch that enthusiasm from you.
Great. Yeah, Megan.
I completely agree with that. I also, I would say start local. And start from helping kids see how they are already doing things in their everyday lives, in their families' lives, in their communities' lives. One of the things that I think is important is that we know kids learn best when we start with what they already know and build on it, not bring things that are from some other place. You build towards understanding kind of global ecologies. But so I would also say start local and start connected to kids' families and communities. And there are lots of actually developing resources. So I just want to point to, there's a project called Learning in Places that I'm a part of. There's also something called STEM Teaching Tools that is a large multi-state project that is continually trying to help teachers find the balance between sort of the demands of schooling and how to do this work. There's lots and lots of resources out there, and I know that can be overwhelming. I often tell teachers to pick one thing to change your practice, or up to 3 things annually so you don't get overwhelmed. So I would say just start, pick something you're passionate about, pick something that's local and try it. I think you're muted, Jill.
Thank you so much. I'm going to have another one for you, Megan, here, and then I'll look for another volunteer. This one says, regarding the concept of science literacy, what are some shifts that we should focus on for incorporating native ways of knowing into improved definitions of science literacy? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would point to those resources again. I appreciate the question. I think that one of the things that conservation scientists, climate change scientists are recognizing around the world that people have always made knowledge about the natural world, and native ways of knowing are about a particular empirical way of knowing that sometimes interfaces and is different than Western forms of science, but also intersects. And I think that for teachers, being able to embrace that there are multiple ways of knowing that can add, that can pull out important tensions and differences, rather than suggesting there's one right way to do this, actually leads to more equitable classrooms all the time. I think the other thing that I want to say about this is that I would definitely, Robin Kimmer is like my superhero about all of these things. She's remarkable. Kyle White is another scholar who's been thinking about the intersections of Western science and native ways of knowing for a long time. I want to say one thing that is a real challenge, though, is as we do that, making sure that we don't appropriate or actually romanticize Indigenous communities and knowledges and our experiences. And I think that I started out by saying the more equitable societies that we have socially leads to healthier nation and healthier natural worlds too. So as we engage native ways of knowing, I often say to people, if native people stand with scientists, will scientists stand with us? And so I also think that as you engage native ways of knowing, taking seriously what it means to think about upholding our sovereignty, upholding that we've had very complicated relations and the United States has been invested in our removal is really important. Right now, there are the Wampanoag tribe had the federal government issue a revoking of their sovereignty 2 weeks ago in the middle of COVID. And so there are ways that political assaults on tribal communities is an ongoing thing. And I think that to engage in right relations with native ways of knowing and native peoples means that you have to uphold our ethical relationships with each other. And to me, one of the things that becomes interesting about that is that it helps us think, in my view, forward about the kinds of worlds that we'll need. And why it is that there's been oppositional political relationships between native peoples in the United States and non-native peoples for so long.
Very good, thank you. Allison, I'm going to have you take this one. It's a question on how do we make it easier for students to get out of the classroom and outdoors? Because there are problems, particularly in some metropolitan areas where it's logistically difficult, it's expensive to have out of classroom experiences. There may be safety issues. What can be done to help mitigate some of those barriers to nature?
Well, I would point to some of the local community-based conservation programs that occur throughout the city of Chicago, including areas that have had industrial degradation, water pollution, heavy metal contamination. There have been examples where communities have rallied around the ecological injustices that have been happening in their neighborhoods and used it essentially as a teaching point, as a talking point, as a way to engage the rest of the community. In fact, in the Calumet area, certainly Big Marsh Preserve, which is now a Chicago park, has undergone an incredible amount of restoration, remediation activities to remove those metals, and they're in the process of building nature centers, and actually one of the first campgrounds within the city of Chicago and in the Southeast Side in an area that has been fairly underserved in terms of ecological opportunities and opportunities to go to nature centers. One of the things that the Nature Museum does is we partner with a number of Chicago public schools to do Science on the Go programs where our educators actually come out to classrooms. Oftentimes they're bringing animals from our living collection as a way to teach children how to make observations about form, function, structures, and biology of a variety of organisms. So that's one of the ways the Nature Museum has continued to get that engagement and expanded message out to areas where maybe there is a lack of public open space as a resource.
Very good. And this is written for you, being a Midwesterner and in love with the ocean. The question is, much of the plastics in the oceans comes from the terrestrial surface. For Chicago, this means what goes into the Mississippi goes into the Gulf. How can we better connect what happens here with our oceans?
Such an important thing to do too. And again, same, I've grown up in the Midwest, so I get how it's so easy to not understand the connection between waterways and that everything eventually goes to the ocean. I think spending more time on beaches, even if it's the beaches of Lake Michigan, to see where our refuse winds up, to understand where sewer systems wind up going, to just have a better awareness of how water is treated and where it winds up. You look at organizations like Alliance for the Great Lakes, which really focuses on getting people to understand the value of our freshwater resources. Because if we're not valuing our freshwater, we're certainly not going to value our oceans, because that's even farther removed from that. So in terms of plastic pollution, it's really simple to think that your impacts don't make a difference. And I think that's the biggest issue with understanding the scale of ocean plastic issues. Whenever I do talks about this, I show people a series of images from Clipperton. So Clipperton Atoll is the most remote island in the world. It takes 96 hours to get there from the coast of Mexico on good ocean conditions. So it's minimum 3 days away, basically. It's an 8-mile around ring of land, and it looks absolutely stunning when you're pulling up to it. It's got a few palm trees on it. It's this beautiful white sand. You think, wow, what an idyllic place, so far removed. And the second you step on the beach, you will not take one step around all 8 miles that does not require you to step on plastic. This is not plastic that anyone has put there. Nobody went and dumped plastic onto Clipperton. But what has gone on is that all of these ocean gyres collect all of the plastic that gets dumped all over, whether it's from our island nations or from our cities. And it collects in these regions of the ocean, and it swirls around and gets washed up on the beaches. Now, that's something that each one of us can prevent by making different choices. Possibly it's something as simple as not using straws. Maybe it's when you have an opportunity to buy something in glass, do that instead. If you're going to have, plastic 6-pack rings, make sure you at least cut them so they don't wind up around the neck of an animal. It's not that we have to immediately cease use of plastic, because that's not doable. But it's making that shift with our individual choices that adds up. And I think it's just the importance of realizing that your choices do matter. It's a lot of people out there, and if 8 billion people say my choices don't make a difference, I promise you they do. And I think it's just, realizing our collective power, and that can be a good thing and a bad thing. We've created this problem, so it's also one that we have to fix because we're the only ones who can.
Thank you. And we have a few other questions, but unfortunately our time is starting to wane, and wanted to give each of you, 2 of you, who have an additional webinar that you're participating in yet tonight because of your expertise and in demand, and actually we'll be talking internationally. So we are so, so grateful to have you all on the panel tonight. But would like to challenge each of you to address the question on this eve of Earth Day, the 50th anniversary. What is your greatest hope for people and Earth as we move forward into year 51, as we look at our relationship with Earth? Any volunteers to go first? I know. Very good.
Sorry about that. So yeah, going into Earth Day 50 is kind of a big deal, considering 50 years ago, the first Earth Day involved 20 million Americans. They went outside for this first Earth Day and protested in favor of an eco-conscious future. And the catalyst for Earth Day's creation by a senator from Wisconsin was actually the largest oil spill in U.S. history at the time, which was an accident that leaked about 100,000 gallons of crude into Santa Barbara's waters in 1969. So that was one of the catalyzing events for the start of Earth Day. And we find ourselves in the midst of this pandemic, of another crisis that we've never really seen the likes of before. Just as that at the time was the largest oil spill, well, this is the largest global issue we've probably dealt with ever, especially on an epidemiological level. So it shows you, though, that over the course of 50 years, look at how much good has been done. Obviously, it could always be more. Like, we can always be doing more, but it's recognizing that the trajectory is good. Trying to remember the exact Martin Luther King quote, but it's, I think the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And we have to remember that. And I was talking about this with somebody the other day, that it's so frustrating sometimes when you think you're not making enough progress, whether it's personally or societally or globally, you just think, gosh, we could be doing so much better than this. But when you look at how far we've come, even in just 50 years since the first Earth Day, it's pretty remarkable. And there might be peaks and troughs in that bending of the arc towards justice, but we're getting there. And the average is good. So with over 1 billion people stuck in their homes for Earth Day, it's a good time to reflect on how far we've come and where we want to go.
Very good. Thank you. Allison?
Can you hear me? Okay. So I would say my greatest hope as we move forward is that we can all kind of get past some of the political infighting that we have around some of these environmental issues, and get everyone on the same page to realize the risk that we're facing as we continue to do some of the actions that we've been perpetuating. The rapid loss of species just in the last, I'd say, 30 years, specifically in the taxonomic groups that I work with, have really been shocking. And I do think that people still view it through this very disconnected lens of that's happening elsewhere, when really this is happening in our backyard. I think we have made improvements. I think we've seen success in some conservation interventions. I hope in the case of bird conservation, we have actually seen some conservation interventions and reintroduction efforts take off. We've seen similar restoration efforts in even sites that were industrial sites in Europe kind of recover through biological remediation. We've seen large mammals come back to these areas, and we have seen this kind of wave of recovery. Really, human willingness is one of the biggest obstacles that I see, and I do hope that with this COVID pandemic, people are taking the time to kind of reprioritize and refresh. And just from being out in the forest preserves, the number of people that I've seen out hiking, I do think that they will continue to value having access to natural places, I think that if we continue along that trajectory, we'll be in better shape than we were before.
Cindy, what are your thoughts and hopes on this eve of Earth Day 50?
I was just reading about the Midwestern cholera epidemic and the influenza epidemic reading, right? But I was struck by how after they were over, people pretty much forgot the disasters that had been and went back to a lot of the ways of normal living. I think we talked about normal. So I think my hope is this pandemic will be a wake-up call for us that as we navigate the changes, as so many people find themselves outdoors, some of them, who I never seen outdoors in my neighborhood before, that this will be an opportunity for them to connect and engage with the natural world, for them to begin building a relationship with it. When good health comes back to our world, that we won't forget. In remembrance is redemption. I think that was Elie Wiesel. We have to remember and we have to learn. And even though it's going to be painful to remember, I think good can come out of this. And so on Earth Day, my hope is that we will leave this time, this Earth Day week, better people, stronger people, and people with a more open mind, with a more awareness of how much we have and the value of the natural world. And that we'll move forward and be stronger and more conservation minded because of it.
And Megan, your thoughts?
Well, I'm wondering if Alex wants to wave goodbye. I saw your post. Do you want to just say a quick goodbye?
I do. Thank you so much. I'm really sorry to have to go, but I'm supposed to be on my next session in 4 minutes. So thank you all so much for being part of this tonight. It's been really wonderful hearing all of your perspectives and coming from all different backgrounds. Thank you for sharing. It's been really enlightening. And and thanks to everyone who's been watching us as well. Enjoy your Earth Day, and I hope we can all stay in touch.
Good wishes to you, Alex, and thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Happy Earth Day.
You too.
Megan, so thank you for noticing that. That's what happens when you use readers and you can't quite reach out there. So thoughts on this eve of Earth Day?
I hope that we decide to choose everyday forms of life that actually bring forth more life, that we choose to be actors that contribute to diversity in all kinds, whether it's ecological diversity or cultural diversity in our social worlds. And I really do think that's the choice. Like, how are we going to celebrate life when we've had to be sequestered, physically distanced from life in different kinds of ways? And how can we think about living close to lives, all kinds of lives, in ways that honor them? I will say this, I have a couple of I would love to see more people take up imagining what our rights of nature are and thinking about evolving our legal, all of our infrastructures that move towards conservation. So the rights of nature kind of paradigms that have been gaining ground in different nations is interesting to me. It may be imperfect as it is, but there are movements to think deeply about structural shifts that we need. And I hope that as people recognize how close our structures are, that we continue to really imagine what's possible in new forms. And the other thing that I'll say is that clean water helps us all. It's one of the key issues that is hurting human life. It's hurting more than human life. And I've been deeply dismayed by the rollbacks that have been happening around the progress in the US around clean water. And in Chicago in particular, the removal of dams. I've been engaging young people in recognizing the increase of biodiversity in the Chicago River and indicators of other health. And so I hope as people are engaging in the forest preserves, I hope they're taking walks along the Chicago River and they're recognizing how when we're quieted, the rest of the world actually is present differently too. And so that we might hold some of that quiet more than perhaps we did in pre-COVID worlds.
You have all been amazing, amazing panelists, and thank you for your thoughts, your insights. We also want to thank you, the audience, who tuned in and had this shared experience over and over again tonight. We talked about that relationship to nature, relationship with one another, and the challenges and the hopes that you just heard from this diverse group of experts deeply committed to caring for the world in many different ways through education and writing and practice and science. We hope that this gets you in the thought of Earth Day, of celebrating tomorrow, the 50th anniversary, and thinking about your role in that. The Nature Museum has many, many programs in which you can engage. This webinar has been recorded and will be available. We, again, are so appreciative of you joining us and wish you all the best. And be well, be safe. Thank you so much.